We're going to start. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I would like to thank the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, who has teamed up with the journals American Prospect and American Affairs to host this bipartisan series of free virtual panels today, the 22nd, the 24th, and the 29th. The 4 panels will examine flaws in today's application of Section 230 and consider the suggestions for how to fix the problem. The panels will feature discussions with policy and technology experts, as well as individuals who have been impacted by the platform's failure to curb unlawful activity on their services. Each panel will close with a Q&A session. My name is Rick Lane, I'm CEO of Iggy Ventures, and I will be today's moderator of the panel that focuses on the real story behind Section 230, a view from those who were there. When CDA was adopted into law in 1996, only 20 million Americans had regular access to the internet, and most logged on using a telephone modem. Smartphones, social media, the algorithms that power today's global platforms hadn't even been invented. This panel will examine the origins and original intent of Section 230, reveal how early tech giants responded to the public safety issues in the early days, and illuminate how judicial interpretations of the law skewed the original intent, leading us to where we are today. It's an honor and a privilege for me to have this series opening remarks come from the Commerce Committee Chair Pallone and Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers, 2 members who will be critical in the reform of Section 230 and have been real leaders on the internet public policy issues. I think we
and Commerce Committee, the committee that was originally responsible for Section 230 and that has jurisdiction over the law today. It's time for meaningful and thoughtful reform to the law. I'm alarmed by the spread of online disinformation, extremism, and other harmful content, particularly on social media, where there are little to no guardrails in place to stop it. Unfortunately, this harmful content doesn't just stay online. It has real-world consequences that have turned dangerous and violent. And despite repeated promises to seriously tackle this crisis, social media platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter only make minor changes to their policies in response to the public relations crisis of the day. But the underlying problem remains, and it's now painfully clear that the market or public pressures embedded into the flexibility within Section 230 alone will not compel these social media companies to take the aggressive action they need to take. Real accountability will only come with legislative action. Today, our laws give these companies and their leaders a blank check to do nothing. Rather than limit the spread of disinformation and other harmful content, social media companies have created business models that exploit the human brain's preference for divisive content to get Americans hooked on their platform. It isn't just that social media companies are allowing disinformation and other harmful content to spread, it's that in many cases, they're actively amplifying and spreading it themselves. The dirty truth is that they are relying on algorithms to purposely promote conspiratorial, divisive, or extremist content so they can rake in the ad dollars. And that's because the more outrageous and extremist the content, the more engagement and views these companies get from their users. More views equal more money. But when a company repeatedly promotes harmful content, we should all question whether existing liability protection should apply. Fines, to the extent they are levied at all, have simply become the cost of doing business. The time for self-regulation is over. Members of my committee have suggested legislative solutions. I'm committed to considering these proposals as well as new ones and working closely with my colleagues so we can come together and hold these platforms accountable. And I thank you for having me here today as you discuss these issues and possible solutions.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cathy McMorris Rodgers, the lead Republican of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm pleased to help kick off this panel series. A top priority for Republicans on E&C is bringing much needed oversight and reform to big tech. For far too long, big tech has betrayed our trust and put our kids at risk. They've ignored truly harmful and even illegal content on their sites while repeatedly attacking free speech and truth. Big tech is increasingly becoming a destructive force to our society. We understand that it's important for tech companies to have the ability to take down truly harmful content. But a difference in political opinions isn't harmful content. They need to get their priorities in order. The answer to speech we disagree with should be more speech, not less. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are bedrock principles of our free society. They are what has built America and made it unique from the rest of the world. So right now, all options are on the table, including Section 230 reform. As you all know, it's a very complex issue that demands a thoughtful and considerate response. We need to look at this from every angle, especially on how to incentivize these platforms to better protect children. That's why I announced my Big Tech Accountability Platform earlier this year. To be clear, I firmly believe we can both protect innovation and champion American tech leadership while not turning a blind eye to obvious problems we see. Entrepreneurship and innovation are huge economic drivers in America, and we must continue to foster this to ensure American technological leadership. However, it is clear our laws have not kept pace with innovation, and clearly big tech has abused the protections afforded to them by Section 230. From blocking social media content posted by elected government officials in the United States with whom they disagree, to their coordinated suppression of news they deem to be false, most notably with the suppression of information regarding the origins of COVID-19, which has obstructed ongoing investigations, to their prioritizing of speech over protecting children from online predators and even from the harmful habits these companies proactively encourage on their own platforms. Why should they have that power? They are not good stewards of their platforms. Why do they deserve Section 230 protections? Energy and Commerce Committee Republicans are leading efforts to make sure big tech is held accountable. We've received input from every Republican member and welcome Democrat members to join us in our efforts. We will need to get everyone united, and it will be Energy and Commerce leading the way. Again, I hope you enjoy this panel series. I look forward to working and hearing from you in the near future. Thank you.
What inspiring words from Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers and Chairman Pallone. When I think of the early days of the internet public policy, besides the individuals on this panel, a few names come to mind. Jill Lesser, who represented AOL, a young Jim Halpert working with Ron Plesser, and of course, the father of the internet public policy, Jerry Berman, who was the founder of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Back in 2018, when I was working on FOSTA SESTA, the first reform to Section 230 since its enactment, I reached out to Jerry to get his thoughts. After our conversation, Jerry posted these words. Remember the internet was when the internet was born. Who knew it would grow to be a dominant media? Nobody. Obviously, laws have to be updated. Nerds know I helped draft Section 230, which allows platforms to publish anything and not be responsible. Makes sense because we love free speech and don't want companies and ISPs to be liable for every post they edit or publish. The internet has thrived. That's great. But the idea was ISPs would be good Samaritans and take down the worst. People could always go to another platform, so free speech would thrive. But too often, that responsibility was not exercised, like Facebook facilitating disinformation by Russians for rubles. We need to debate, rethink, and reform the statute we helped write. But more needs to be done to strike the right balance. If I was back at CDT, I would be asking you to help sort this out. I know lines are hard to draw, but we could dialogue and figure this out. Very wise words, and that was said back in 2018. Our first panelist is Peter Harter, founder of the Farmington Group, a privately held consulting firm. Peter provides advice to management, investors, boards, and individuals on substance risk and development concerning patents, data, copyright, cybersecurity, energy, export controls, and precision agriculture. But Peter's career began in 1993 as an internet lawyer in his hometown of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then broadened that out in Silicon Valley as head of the global government affairs for Netscape. This is where our story will begin. Peter?
Rick, it's nice to be with you and many colleagues and friends. And I'm speaking to you on 5G from my dad's porch in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, back visiting for Father's Day. And Bethlehem's where I first accessed the internet in 1986. So before there was a CDA, we had something called the AUP, or Acceptable Use Policy, on bulletin board systems and dial-up ISP systems. Yes, I'm a nerd. I remember meeting Jerry Berman and many others at the time grappling with an amendment offered by Senator Exxon to deal with pornography on the internet that his granddaughter had accessed, apparently from a home personal computer. And I was living and working in Cleveland, Ohio at the time, and flew into DC to meet with Senator Exxon's staff because I was worried about liability for the ISPs I was helping to run at the time, nonprofit ISPs. And a colleague of mine said, you should come to this meeting over at Wilmer Hale law firm for all these people worried about the same thing you're worried about, Peter. And there was about 20 people in a room with no windows. And we just talked about who we knew was doing what, talked about language in the bill. And that ad hoc coalition work progressed from then. So it was a group effort, and Jerry was one of the many leaders at that time. And it's great to hear his words today. Rick, you asked me to join today to talk about how we may have gotten to what we regard the CDA. So I'm going to try to do my best to speak from history up until about 1995, when I joined Netscape as their head of government affairs in Mountain View, California. Of course, we all know Netscape started what we refer to as the internet boom. There are movies made about this, TV shows, and many people today go, what's Netscape? I'm that old where people don't know what Netscape is. I think it's part of the history books for some folks, but it's a moment in time that's important, not just because I worked there, but because it sparked the commercialization of internet and thus made the stakes higher for liability. It became a business issue as well as a political issue. So if we go back a bit to the mid to late 1980s and early 1990s, people were starting to use dial-up access, mostly not graphical user interface, not smartphones, not tablets, typically terminal computers, some laptops, some luggables, if you will. And people shared content, all kinds of content, some of it not very nice at times. And so people did worry about liability for what sat on the networks, especially if it was a university network or a government research laboratory or some private foundation where there was use of the networks that was not what was expected. And that hence brought forth the phrase acceptable or unacceptable use policies. And it was about 1992 activity in Congress roughly instructed the National Science Foundation, which was one of the key government agencies for the running of the internet, which is a successor to what came out of the Cold War and the space race in the 1960s, with the Defense Department creating much of the roots of the internet. And I think Congress decided to have the agency figure the problem out of what was acceptable use, not so much at the time about pornography or illegal activity, but fundamentally, should we allow this publicly created resource that had been augmented with many private resources and entities, should we allow someone to make a decision if commercial use was acceptable? I've gone back through the legislative history, the committee reports, the floor debates, and that's generally my impression. Others may not share that, but that's, for what it's worth, that's my impression of the discussion in Congress at the time. I was in law school then, early 1990s, and I was using the internet during law school to conduct clinical work online, electronic contracts, other business activities, electronic signatures. So whether you could conduct business online. And for those here today who are lawyers, 25 or so years ago, it wasn't legal for your bar license in many states to use a cell phone, let alone email, because it wasn't deemed to be secure to maintain the integrity of your attorney-client relationship. But things rapidly changed in the early and mid 90s, thanks to the internet and the commercialization, because the NSF decided to allow commercial activity. It was deemed to be appropriate for these acceptable use policies or AUPs to have commercial activity. And then another parallel stream to weave in here is the breakup of AT&T in the early 80s. And Congress created this massive telecommunications reform law. It was so big it just had to pass. And I think with internet boom and Netscape's IPO and a lot of the commercial activity, in 1996, this Telecom Act was signed into law at the Library of Congress in a major ceremony by President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore using an electric pen of some kind. And also remember, in their first term, Clinton and Gore had this national information superhighway initiative, a green paper and a white paper, a lot of discussions and many issues in that got people thinking about the importance of the internet as a commercial platform. The parting thought I'll leave for, I think, Rick, to hand things off to our next panelist, is that as things were swirling, but yet so few people are actually connected at the time, and there's a lot of effort in the early mid-90s to get schools connected, to get more people connected, and it still goes on today about inclusiveness, which is critically important, that the commercial potential of internet may, in retrospect, may have led people at the time to make decisions that didn't imagine the consequences that are negative that are on the table today. I'm not working on the CDA 230 today as a consulting at my firm, the Farrington Group. In Farrington, that's just my middle name. Like many people in Washington, D.C., you create a consulting firm based on where you live or your name in some respects. So the Farrington Group is just who you're looking at here on the screen. And I'm just trying to provide my friend Rick with a bit of history before I forget too much of it or misremember some of it. The fact remains that people tried hard in 1994, 95, 96 to craft a solution to fit the expectation at the time and the expectation at the time. But let's unleash the commercial opportunity. And we can look back in time saying, well, we should have thought of other equities. I'm sure we should have. But as a person in the room, yes, I'm guilty of contributing to what became the CDA. And I have to look back and think, if only I knew today, well, that's me editorializing about the future. I'll stop there, Rick. It's been a pleasure visiting the past, Rick. Let's go to Christmas present, if that's an appropriate bridge for you to work with. Thank you.
Absolutely, Peter, and thank you so much for your insights. And we're going to have Q&As to really pick your brain on kind of what was happening with inside that room. Our next speaker is Roger Cochetti. Roger is an award-winning Washington, D.C. based author, commentator, and advisor on tech policies. He was an official in the State Department under President Carter before holding senior executive positions in ComSat, IBM, Network Solutions, VeriSign, and CompTIA. IBM at the time of the 96 Telecom Act, especially on tech policy issues, was the adult in the room. And Roger led IBM's policy efforts, both domestically and internationally. Roger is going to provide us what he witnessed as a key player in the enactment of the Communications Decency Act. Roger?
Thank you, Rick. First, make sure, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, you're good.
Most of my presentation today is going to reflect an article I wrote last October for the Hill newspaper. So those of you who have an interest in this and want more detail than I'm going to go over today, you can go to thehill.com, look, search on Cochetti, and you'll see an article that I wrote. It provides quite a bit more detail. I wrote that article mostly because I had seen a number of scholars, politicians, and policy advocates explain what happened in 1995 and 1996 in ways that I knew were not quite what happened. And, you know, obviously everyone has their own recollection, but my goal then and my goal today really is to do no more, no less than set the record straight of what we understood at that time in 1995 and 96. Before doing so, let me make a few quick disclaimers. First, I am not familiar with our sponsors for this event, although I'm grateful to them for hosting it. I worked fairly closely with Rick when he was at the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm happy to participate in the panel he's sponsoring, but I don't want to associate myself in any way with what I'm sure are carefully developed, detailed positions these organizations have. on the subject of 230 because I'm not familiar with them and have my own view. Secondly, in no way, shape, or form am I representing IBM today. I've left the company decades ago, and all I'm doing is recounting what is essentially public record recollections of what was happening at that time. I have nothing but great respect for IBM, but if you want to know what their position is, ask them, not me. Thirdly, unlike Peter and Hemanshu, I am not an attorney, and therefore I'm not trying to offer legal explanations or advice on anything, but simply recollections of what happened in the policy space. For anybody interested in Section 230, you know perfectly well that it is mostly court-made law and not legislative law. So the rest of this seminars or programs in this series are terribly important, and the what happened in the Congress in 1995 and 6 is a piece of a very large puzzle. And lastly, along those same lines, it doesn't take a Supreme Court justice to know that legislative history is a court-defined term, which means things like committee reports and floor speeches. And we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the environment that occurred around the enactment of Section 230, not the legislative history. The world, as Rick said, in 1995 and 1996, was a very different place than it is today. Not only were there just 20 million Americans on the internet, and I differ a little bit with one thing Rick said. Most of the people on the internet in 1995 were not doing dial-up. They were doing work from their office. They had an office-based connection. Most of the dial-up was for online service providers, not internet service providers. And the online service providers are names that are sort of, in some respects, been forgotten to history, but were very important in those days. Prodigy, CompuServe, AOL, and France Telecom's Teletel. Between them, they had as many users as the internet did at that time. And I think in IBM and in almost all large technology companies in 1994, 95, and maybe even into 1996, it was not at all clear whether the future of network computing was going to be online service providers, private networks that had their own proprietary systems, or the network of network, the open internet, the successor to the NSFNet. So it's important to understand that at that time, most of the technology thought leadership in the country, HET, IBM, Dell, you name it, would have said, well, I think the future is probably going to be a mixture of online private networks, internet open networks, and bulletin board services, and a heterogeneous mixture. That was not what happened, but you can forgive all of us for having misjudged the future at that point. For that very reason, the notion of large platforms simply didn't exist. A platform was a bulletin board service or a chat room with hundreds of participants, and sometimes a moderator, sometimes not. That was what people thought of as platforms. IBM played an important role in those days, but we never considered ourselves a thought leader on internet policy. We were a thought follower, and people like Peter Hart and others, who Rick has already mentioned, were the people who we followed in thought leadership. And that was partly because it was not our view in the early mid-90s that it was clear the internet was going to be the dominant network computing platform. It could well have been some mixture of private networks and with the internet on top of that. What that means is that the issue of intermediate liability, what Europeans can call intermediate liability, what we call the Section 230, was not a big issue. It was an obscure kind of remote issue of interest to a small group of people who were fairly expert. But what was a big issue in 1995 and 1996, for those of you who are not old enough to remember it, was this. And what most people will remember, or anybody who was politically active in those days, was that pornography on the internet was a big motivating issue. hundreds of senators and congressmen were afraid that their opponents in the campaigns, in the 96 or 98 campaigns, would accuse them of allowing the internet to spread porn to children. And they wanted to make sure that they were protected and their opponents couldn't accuse them of ignoring it. That's what led to the Exxon Amendment, and that's what led to the support for Section 230. What I would say most members thought they were doing was helping protect the internet from pornography. And I vividly remember two conversations with committee chairmen. The House and the Senate were both Republican at that time. They were both Republican. And I tried to explain to them the notion of intermediate liability, third parties are posting things, the operator shouldn't be liable. And they just stopped me and said, I'm no interest, stop. This is irrelevant, it's unimportant. The only thing I want to know is when my opponent accuses me of allowing pornography on the internet, I'm going to tell them that I did what IBM told me was the safe way to get pornography off the internet. And it's fair to say that IBM's reputation at the time was enough so that that was the shield that they wanted. In all fairness, there were very few congressmen sponsoring this legislation who referring to them would have made much difference to these committee chairmen. So IBM's support was, I think, politically significant. We were, as Rick said, the adult in the room. And that leads me to what may be the most important part of the discussion, that is, we followed the lead of thought leaders in this area. And when they wrote the language of Section 230, we supported it, although it didn't quite or fully reflect what was the political impetus behind the legislation, and that was getting pornography off the internet. This first section of Section 230 talks about what was already emerging law, namely that the interactive service provider is not the publisher of the content that the third party posts. But the second section was the critical part, and it said that if the interactive service provider takes down the content, they're not liable for it. But what it said actually was that they would not be liable for taking down obscene, lewd, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or lascivious content. And that was perfectly reflecting the politics of the time. But then the section went on to say, or otherwise objectionable. And those are the three words that made the internet today and made the large platforms we know today, or otherwise objectionable, because that's what distinguished the anti-porn character of it from the pure liability character for it. The attorneys involved in this knew perfectly well what they were doing. The Congress did not. And when I first saw this language, the or otherwise objectionable, it was a little surprising for me. I consulted with the leading civil rights attorney and who is behind all of this and asked him where did this come from? This was not porn. And he said it was, if you looked at the future, and we would see thousands of computer bulletin boards, thousands of chat rooms, thousands of small content providers, and they each had to differentiate themselves from the other so that they had to take down anything they didn't want, because that's how you could have market competition. The way we were going to have thousands of Facebooks or thousands of Twitters or thousands of Googles in the future was because they would each be able to differentiate themselves from the other, and that was essential for competition. I bought that logic, and I think the result was in part that those three words were incorporated in the law, and the court interpreted them for just what they say, or otherwise objectionable. The result of this, as I pointed out in my article, is that no one anticipated the market concentration that we have today back in the early mid-1990s. It was inconceivable. We were used to a world with thousands of bulletin boards, thousands of little chat rooms, and expected that that's what we'd be seeing in the future. So that's a quick summary of my comments. And like I said, For those of you who have a more intense interest, feel free to look up the article. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, for that insight. Our last speaker is Hemanshu Nigam. Hemu is the founder of SSP Blue, one of the leading advisory firms for online safety, security, and privacy challenges. For the critical time after passage of the Communications Decency Act, 1997 to 2000, Hemu served as the federal prosecutor against child and computer crimes for the U.S. Department of Justice. He also served as an advisor to a Congressional Commission on Child Safety and advisor to the White House on cyber stalking. From 2002 to 2006, Hemu worked for Microsoft, where he led a global initiative to build safety standards into products across the company. From 2006 to 2010, Hemu was the chief security officer for News Corporation's numerous online properties, responsible for helping to protect over 200 million users around the world. He has been credited with making MySpace safe and secure after launching initiatives like Sentinel Safe, a technology to identify and remove criminals from social networking sites. He also drove the launch of over 150 safety, security, and privacy protection features for MySpace and played a key role in the accord between MySpace and 49 state AGs to develop key principles for social networking safety. So Hemu, why don't you take us back to the future to 1997?
Thanks, Rick. And let me do exactly what Peter and Roger did, which is the list of disclaimers. We should actually probably just have them sitting in front of our faces. I'm here as myself, which I don't think I can ever be not myself. So that's kind of an irrelevant statement. But I'm here not representing anybody, any entity, nor am I speaking for MySpace today, because in case people don't know, it actually still does exist today. And you can go to myspace.com and sign into an account. I think Time Inc. owns it at the time, or currently right now. But I do want to go back to something, because when Roger and Peter were talking, the most interesting part that I was hearing was the things that happened. And then I joined DOJ, the Child Exploitation Section, in 1997. So all those debates had happened. And when I showed up, there was all discussions about what are companies doing, what are companies not doing. And that became, in many ways, the fascinating aspect, because I was on the inside in the criminal world, seeing the outcomes of things that were happening as people started realizing, hey, there's an avenue here that you can use for adults to get to kids, or people to do things like cyber stalking or things like that, right? And I remember many times having two kinds of discussions with companies. One of them was, well, the law doesn't require me to do anything. That's what this Section 230 is all about. And the other one was more from the folks who were on the enforcement side, or the folks who were sitting in the abuse teams and looking at the things they were seeing, who were saying, well, maybe I could do this, maybe I could do that, maybe I could solve the problem from that end. And as a prosecutor, I had the power of subpoena, right? So we were bringing cases by collecting the information the companies had and then using it to build our case into the physical world. But at the end of the day, one thing that became ultimately very clear was that whatever was happening online was not happening online. It was happening in the real world. And there was this notion in many of the meetings, which is there's an online world and there's an offline world. And people would talk about, well, online versus offline. At the end of the day, though, there was in my world a victim. That victim lived in the physical world. That victim had a mind that was emotionally hurt, sometimes physically hurt, but it started through something that happened in, let's say, online, but in their world, it happened in their world, online or off. There was no distinction. So in many ways, we inside the government were seeing the results of what could happen when decisions were being made in certain ways. We also saw the tension that was built inside these companies from people who had to either build the systems, enforce the policy, react to the abuse things. And there were people who had to make the decision of what does the law say and what does the law require. which was an interesting dichotomy because you constantly were being exposed at the time, starting in 97 onward, of the possibilities that existed based on who you spoke to and the role that they're playing and the function they had and the representation they were doing. And in a strange way, I realized that making friends with many of the engineers was the best thing I could do in some of these companies to really understand what was possible and understand that it could actually have an impact or not have an impact. And in other words, then identify what is the problem to be solved and then focus on trying to solve those problems. And so that was the world of life in DOJ intersecting with life in the blossoming tech community at the time. And then when you fast forward through the days of Microsoft, and Rick had asked me to talk about some of the things we did inside of MySpace, but I think one of the best ways to understand it is we took the approach, and this is all the public information that we constantly talked about at the time, we took the approach that let's not look at this as online and offline. Let's look at this as a world. Whatever happens, what is it that is the pure equivalent? If somebody says online, let me identify the pure equivalent of that, whatever thing it is in the online space into the offline world. So based on that, we broke the notions down into what were originally 3 categories and then became 4 categories, which is looking at conduct of people. How are they interacting with each other, especially in a place where we had gone from the pure, the world of the B2B or the B2C into the world of the C2C supported by the business. And we started looking at conduct and started asking ourselves, well, what happens in the physical world when there's conduct between people that's not supposed to be in a certain way? What can we do to build mechanisms that reflect the real world society? And then we looked at content. What is it that happens, for example, and at the time we were using the example of the 42nd Street before New York City had completely changed. But when you walk down 42nd Street, there's all sorts of content. There's content that's appropriate for adults, content that's inappropriate for children, things like that. How do we handle it in the physical world? And what can we do to build mechanisms to handle it in this new space that we were looking at? The third was contact between individuals, not just the conduct of individuals, but contact. If I want to contact somebody in the physical world, we looked at that and said, if I'm an adult walking down the street, I see a 13-year-old and I want to contact the person and at a mall, what would happen? And in fact, we spoke to 13-year-olds who said, well, we would say, that's creepy, guys, stay away. And interestingly, we started realizing if we can take that and wrap it with a technological solution that tries to emulate the same kinds of things that would happen in the physical, which is, well, if I don't know you, would I be able to do that very easily? And an example that came out of that is an adult cannot contact a 13-year-old unless the 13-year-old initiates it, because for me to contact that stranger would be an unusual event in the physical world as an adult walk with a stranger 13-year-old as it would be in the online world. There's no difference. Let's figure out how to recreate those mechanisms. And the more we did it, and the more we focused on trying to find those physical world solutions, the more we realized that was actually something, and it was an engineering challenge that could be solved, and people were solving it. And then we realized there's this other world that was blossoming that was really, really, really unusual. And I started understanding the perspective being and sitting in the inside world and looking at it and realized there's this whole area of space that was created that we were not aware of when I was sitting inside a DOJ, which is the online company had in a sense become the mayor, the policymaker, the legislator, the enforcer, the educator, the crisis expert, the doctor, the every bit of all the things that happen, and was a pure reflection of what is the physical world happening in this online environment. They became almost mirrors of each other. And that's where the fourth C came from, which is collaboration. And because of that reason, you have to find ways to collaborate with those experts who are also the experts in the communities that people lived in. So I think, in a sense, when Rick and I had talked earlier, he was saying, well, kind of show what happened, what can happen. So in that sense, we took this approach and ended up in this world that we are now in today. And now we can fast forward to today, as I think Peter or Roger was saying, but I'm living right now back in 97 and those other days. So I'm not coming back to the reality.
Well, thank you, Hemu. We have a couple of quick, some questions and answers that we'd like to open up to the attendees. But the first question that has arisen says clearly Section 230 was designed to limit liability when platforms do take voluntary actions to moderate undesirable content. The whole point was to reverse the Stratton-Oakmont decision. But now some claim that Section 230 was intended to limit liability even when platforms don't moderate harmful activity. Do any of you recall having discussions about that during the CDA's consideration?
Well, I'll say quickly as the non-attorney on the panel, but IBM, you may recall, was a co-owner of Prodigy with Sears Roebuck at the time of Stratton Oakmont. And the essence, what made Prodigy different from CompuServe was that IBM and Sears wanted a family-oriented private online service. That was the concept. So it was family-oriented, recipes and children's stuff and whatnot. And that led to some degree of moderation. I think it was of surprise to no one when Stratton Oakmont or came back, and certainly I was in touch with the Prodigy, we owned them, and they gave us their explanation that the court would say that if you don't moderate, then you're not liable. It's just like, bulletin board in my apartment building when I was in college. It was there and anybody put up what they want, and the owner never took anything up or put it down, and nobody assumed the building owner was liable. But the key issue was really never that, as I understood it, liability if you don't moderate, because that seemed to be fairly established or not highly controversial, put it that way. The issue was liability if you do start to moderate and then you start to take on the role of the publisher. So I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but what I would say that operators like CompuServe, completely different business strategy than Prodigy, and that goes back to what a lot of bulletin boards are like, and the libertarian views of a lot of early people. Peter could probably speak more to this than I can. The early internet users were fairly libertarian, and they said some pretty unnice things on bulletin boards that, was nobody's business but theirs, was their attitude. So I'm not sure if that helps, but it may put some context on it.
No, absolutely. Peter, what about you? Netscape being such a intermediary at the time and so well known, what were some of the concerns that you were facing and looking at during CDA 230?
One of the, I think, untold stories at Netscape is that Jerry Yang and David Philo were at Stanford with their directory, and like many other companies, Cisco before them and Google after them and Sun well before them. After a time, David and Jerry couldn't run their Yahoo directory on Stanford servers because of liability, but also space constraints. Back then, servers were horrifically expensive, connections were expensive. It was a real financial burden for the university, as I recall. And David Philo and Jerry Yang approached Mark Andreessen, as I was told, can we have Yahoo's directory hosted on Netscape servers? And Mark Andreessen wanted to focus on enterprise, not consumer. And things went on a different way. Yahoo became a far bigger company than Netscape ever did. And Netscape at the end pivoted to leveraging its popular website to save the company after the browser war had depleted the company's resources in enterprise software. And that enabled the sale of Netscape to AOL. So for me, Netscape, the liability soared, and as I said earlier, the focus on the commercial opportunity, it was a vortex from 1994 to 1999, maybe 2000, when the dot-com crash happened. You knew things were going sideways in 99 when there were just too many startup parties with Cirque du Soleil performers. It was really, really weird back then for a kid from Pennsylvania. Really, really odd to see what money was spent on. Anyway, ever remember a company called Blackbird? Kind of a bolster Rodgers' point and answer the question that Rick just posed. There was a serious debate in the early 90s, the anticipation of the 96 Telecom Act. Capital is being deployed. There were experiments like Cube in Ohio that Warner Cable ran for interactive local cable television. And there were a lot of headlines about the 500 channel cable universe, interactive cable, video on demand and the like. And, Microsoft bet on Blackbird as a competitor to AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, General Electric, small company, had a thing called Genie. There were other walled gardens. And colleagues in Europe said, well, we had this walled garden in France called Minitel. And now we're kind of back with walled gardens. If you look at the press coverage of the debate over Apple and Google and the app stores and so on, the walled garden metaphor has been used in the media to cover those. I think it's a different kind of walled garden, but there are some strings of similarity worth reflecting upon. Yeah, I do think, Rick, a lot went into the cooking of the CDA, and the Good Samaritan, obviously getting a letter at Netscape from Senator Dianne Feinstein in 1995 saying, "Dear CEO of Netscape, please take all the bomb-making recipes off the internet. Have a nice day." And this letter comes down to me in my cubicle, and I'm told to figure this out. I mean, do we go to the library and take all the books off the library shelves? I mean, or encryption. Netscape had secure sockets layer, SSL, still in use to this day around the entire planet. Every device uses some version of SSL to provide for secure e-commerce. And that violated US export control laws at the time in 95. Our CEO go to jail. Our company would be nationalized theoretically, I guess. People would print algorithms on their t-shirts or in books and walk on planes and go outside the country. Or you teach in class with foreign national students. Are you violating export controls? What is the Good Samaritan line? So it was part of the mix in the room for sure on a variety of topics, some involving intellectual property, privacy, security, for-profit and nonprofit. But the record is a bit frayed. We'd be better off having some of the people you mentioned, like Jill and Jerry, here to refresh our collective recollection. But I'd say, to answer your question, Rick, it wasn't the table, but it didn't make it to the final cut, obviously.
Yeah, I remember working with Bob Goodlatte at the time on the encryption and loosening the restrictions on encryption when I was at the U.S. Chamber, and we finally got that done. And that another where these issues kind of overlap a little bit. A portion of illicit material online is not speech. When a user sells drugs, traffics people, was there any discussion or consideration for differentiating between the speech and the conduct that help facilitate that? So there's one where you have libel issues and it's free speech and much more difficult to regulate, as we saw with the Supreme Court's decision on the big part of the Communications Decency Act and the Exxon Amendment. But was there a lot of discussion about the facilitation or knowledge around the bulletin boards of others of engaging or helping to facilitate within their platforms purely illegal activities that wasn't related to speech?
I think.
Go ahead, Peter, please.
I think one of our colleagues who's passed, John Perry Barlow, and I think it was New York Times op-ed, he posted the screen from cyberspace, his Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace and Sovereignty. And to Rodgers' point, a lot of libertarians were in the mix, and for very good reasons. Were they in favor of bad actors doing bad activity all the time online? Probably not. But in the early days, internet people thought, if we make very big decisions early on, are we going to prematurely stunt the commercial opportunity? I keep coming back to the thing commercial opportunity because we had this internet boom, for better or worse, capitalism run amok, if you will. And it didn't address a lot of inequities in society we still have today. Broadband, as I mentioned, one of them. But I think people generally agreed, let's not restrict speech. And that's kind of what the ranking member, McMorris Rodgers, talked about in her recorded remarks. And I think a lot of people on the left and right would agree. We want more speech, more inclusion versus just one side and suppression of other voices. So that's kind of like the brake pedal being tapped, if you will. And we can look back retrospectively and say this was a poorly designed law. There was a lot of political pressure. You remember the Clinton-Gore administration, they were under a lot of pressure. Clinton did not win a majority of the popular vote. He had Ross Perot campaigning, made the 92 election very different for the country. And Bill Clinton brought a lot of media innovation to the table for political sabotage, if you will, helped create bloggers, become an industry that covered his political picadillos, if you will. And other politicians had issues. We had the discussion, Rick, in our preparation of Gary Hart and Donna Rice Hughes and her role later on in parts of the CDA. So political scandal, I think, weighed in part on the Clinton-Gore administration to have a reasonable deal on liability. And with Newt Gingrich taking over Congress for the first time for Republicans in a very long time, 94, cutting a deal in a conference committee. Yes, there was actually a conference committee. And one of the young appointees, that conference committee from Seattle, Rick White, was, as I recall, working on the CDA language with Newt Gingrich and conservatives versus the expose or risk-averse folks in the Democratic Party who just wanted a deal done to move forward. Plus, there's so much money at the table after AT&T being broken up, all pent up. Got to get the Telecom Act passed. So I think CDA kind of, maybe the people in the room with CDA were not the perfect group, but there was a vehicle leaving, and there's so much pressure to get this liability issue addressed in some part. And that was beyond anyone's control in the CDA group. We were a small part of a much larger conversation going on. So you have to pull all these threads together, and I'm sure I'm missing tons, but there are no definitive answers to some of these very good questions for reasons that are beyond the control of our programming.
Roger?
Just quick, yes, I would add that, and the questions keep coming up. Did you think about this? Was there much discussion about that? And I think what you have to realize is that it was about a year and a half before this was enacted, the world was shocked to learn that Bill Clinton said, "I know how to use a computer." But that was only more shocking than the fact that Al Gore said, "I own a computer." And no doubt Dick Cheney said, "I have a secretary for that. She does the typing." So, you know, the world was a different place. It's important to understand that. To the extent that there was political oxygen around the CDA, it was sucked out by pornography on the internet. If there was any political oxygen left, it was sucked up by libertarian, don't regulate me, anything goes, blah, blah, blah. And if there was any oxygen left after that, it was the classic business notion of product differentiation. Every little bulletin board, every little chat room has to differentiate itself from the others in order to compete and create its own market. So between those three, there was really very little political oxygen left to deal with these mega issues that we're discussing today. So I'm afraid to say, I'm sorry to say that many of the answer to many of these questions is sadly no, there was very little discussion about, well, what about illegal activity? Other than the fact that the CDA, of course, if the interactive computer service operator is engaged in illegal activity, and the illegal activity is illegal anyway, then the perpetrator and the service provider are not immune. But that was simply a shield to say that this doesn't protect people against criminal activity. So, but that was really kind of a protective afterthought. There's no political momentum behind that.
Well, I find that very interesting, Roger, because the issue of state criminal law was completely undercut that and carved out. So it's only federal criminal law that is applicable, not state criminal law. And nowadays, I can't imagine the state attorneys generals saying, "Oh, we're okay with that you're going to take away our criminal law enforcement." And Hemu knows a little bit about state AGs fighting the fight with 49 of them coming after him, or not at him, but at MySpace, and having to be the point person. But a question came up related to that, which is, assuming Section 230 was included to prevent liability claims from killing the anticipated innovation from the internet and all the follow-on commercial benefits, how would fully repealing 230 impact platforms, big and small, and potential future innovation on the internet? And this is the question that comes down to those who think Section 230 is like the 10 Commandments and written in stone and should never be changed. And to those who, like even the now President Biden stated, he supported full repeal. And then there's a group of folks who are kind of in the middle who think that it should be modified. But that question of full repeal is one that keeps being asked. And Hemu, from your days at MySpace and Microsoft, what do you think would have occurred with the full repeal of Section 230?
So, that's a question that's actually, I'm maybe the worst person to answer. And let me say it because of this reason. During the times then when we were trying to solve the problems that were happening in the online space, we weren't doing it from the perspective of, well, 230 exists, so therefore this or therefore that. We were doing it from the perspective of, what is it that we want the company to stand for? Do we want a company that has adult content or non-adult content? Do you want a company that has adults and children on it, or just one of the categories that we're going to focus on? And so what we did in many of these settings was first identify what is it that we stand for, and then we identified what is it that we need to do to allow that to happen for that business to thrive. And in the strangest way, we weren't having discussions around 230. We were having discussions around, do we want it? And if we do, what do we have to do to prevent the bad stuff from happening? And what do we have to do to make the good stuff happen that we want it to happen? Or if we don't want it, what do we have to do to block, stop, negate, deal with it, build the internal systems, the external systems, the systems for the users to have the power to let us know about those kinds of things. So and that's why I say I may be the worst person to answer that, because that wasn't in the back or the front of our mind, unless it was brought up by somebody in many ways inside the Beltway, because I was sitting in Beverly Hills where MySpace was located, while the teams that were dealing with those concepts were sitting there. And every time those discussions came up, for us, it was, we're just trying to solve the problems that we think we need to solve in order to be the company we want to be.
Rick, can I just say,
Sure,
disagree with one thing, and that is, I think I'm the worst person to try to answer that question. My purpose here today is to talk about what happened in 1995 and 1996. I'm neither well informed enough nor smart enough to answer a question like that. It's incredibly important, and hopefully future panels will talk about it, but I don't have a contribution to make to something that is complicated and important.
Peter, are you following Rodgers?
No, I'm not going to punt on it. Oracle moved its headquarters from Silicon Valley to Texas. A lot of people have left California. California, the first time in its history, has lost a congressional seat. And this chairman and CEO of Hawaiian Airlines spoke at a Stanford Business School conference recently and they proudly announced, this is back in February, March, before air travel really kind of began to pick back up. They launched the first ever in history direct flight from Texas to Hawaii, from Austin to Honolulu, because so many people from the Bay Area have moved to Austin or other parts in Texas and missed direct flights to Hawaii. I just would say the answer to your question, Rick, is follow the money. I think 25 years ago, you wanted to have low regulation to allow the commercial opportunity, my theme, to flourish. Today, we see large tech platforms from China competing with American tech platforms. And that's a very important debate above my pay grade. So I think today, going forward, a group that's brighter than the people assembled here today, who are thinking about today and the future, should wrestle with, is a solution for America's national interest in having tech giants. I think there is we rather have them here than overseas, because at Netscape, the argument to the Hill was, if you don't change US export control laws and encryption, some kid in his mom's basement in South Africa, this was Thought Consulting, he has the keys to e-commerce. And we had a huge 30-foot tall screenshot of the kid's website. And this was the Pro Code Act, co-sponsored by Senator Barbara Boxer, Democrat of California, and Comrade Burns, Republican of Montana. It kind of made John McCain choke, because he was an opponent of liberalization of export control laws at the time. And we made that low regulation argument. It worked at that time for, I think, a durable reason to this day. Does that durability survive today with 230 CDA? I don't know, but I think it's a great question. And I don't know if Texas versus California on low regulation is really an honest conversation to have, because we can push activity to other places where there's not rule of law, not property rights, not labor rights, not environmental rights, not currency rights, and add more to that list. And that becomes a bigger debate than we're here today for. But it's a question that probably tees off the next segment in your series.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we wrap up, I don't know if you have any last thoughts before we do, but just to follow up on what Peter was saying, you really do kind of wonder what would have happened if 230 never, Section 230 never was, and how the courts would have determined, and if that would have been a better structure. And we don't know what we don't know at the time, but the status quo seems very problematic. We do know the harms that are being caused now that we didn't know were happening in the past. And the last panel of this 4-series panel will talk about possible solutions of how to fix that without harming the internet. The other thing that's interesting now is that in the international world, and international governments around the world are changing and changing their own laws. And what a great opportunity for the United States to be the lead and show how to do it right, and not worry, and especially around encryption and these other issues, that we could be the thought leaders, because they're doing it anyway. And why don't we create the environment that makes it the balance that Jerry talked about, where we look at the pluses and minuses and try to figure out how to do it correctly. And that will be the 4th panel. But the next panel that we have is going to be on harms. And it's harms by Section 230, barring access to the courtroom. And this gets into what the Section 230 on the civil litigation side, both at the federal level and at the state and local level, the impact of 230 on the ability to hold platforms accountable. And so these are going to be individuals who can talk about their own experiences. What we want to do with this series is to create and begin the dialogue of how do we modify 230 without repealing it, keeping the good without throwing out, without keeping the good and getting rid of the bad. And so those are part of the discussions that we're going to have over the next couple of weeks. But before I close out, I want to thank the panelists, but do they have any last words of wisdom of what the future holds or does not hold, or past experiences that they would like to share?
I'll take one quick shot at it and say that in this we've properly been talking about Section 230 today. Europe shortly thereafter enacted its own law. The EU had its own law, using the very same legal principles. And I remember vividly explaining to a number of European policymakers who were asking why they should support intermediate liability protection. And the truth is, believe it or not, the most persuasive argument I could make in the mid 1990s to European policymakers for intermediate liability protection was, it's only the internet. It's only the internet, don't worry. And that alone got me more support than any of the logical reasons that all of the advocates for it then, and especially today, would make. So, you know, it was a different time, a different world, and we need to understand that, and that sort of reflects a lot of what we were talking about today.
It's sort of like what Hemu had to experience when he was talking to the AGs and with MySpace, and he kept saying, well, what about Facebook? And like, don't worry about Facebook, they're tiny. You know, we're just going to focus on MySpace. And so, Hemu?
The one thing I want to say is, and this has been true from the beginning to this day, we have discussions like these, whether it's in the Hill or other places. What was missing then is what is missing today, but we have an opportunity to change, is bring engineers to the room who are disinterested stakeholders, because the minds that they have in solving problems, especially if you say they can't solve that problem, is incredible. And the ability to see where things could be taken is also incredible. And so I think that's something that is honestly lacking in any of these debates. And so this is more about how finding those people out there, inviting them to the discussions, having them educate people so that they know, okay, now I really get what that means. I thought it used to mean this, but now I really get it, especially if they're disinterested stakeholders.
Well, thank you, Hemu. And I'd also like again to thank the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, the American Prospect, and American Affairs for hosting this first panel discussion and the three that will follow. I'm looking forward to the next panelists. Again, Tuesday at 3 p.m. The following one's Thursday at 3 p.m. And then the one after that is Tuesday at 3 p.m. So please register, and we look forward to your comments. And thank you to the panelists for a very insightful history of the creation of CDA and the Communications Decency Act. Thank you very much.